I've got a few questions for you that spring to mind. One of which is, you're talking really about an enabling government that will sit in between the convening power that you talked about and bring different groups together and almost maximise the impact by bringing those groups together. I do wonder, after 16 years of nationalist government, where the rhetoric has been very social justice focused, where the idea of wealth creation and entrepreneurialism is given, nodding space, but actually isn't really part of the main discussion that's been going on. How much of the role of government is actually about changing culture and the national conversation and what it's okay to promote and to be positive about, as much as it is about delivery?
Look, I think it's absolutely vital. So, first of all, I think in recent months we've done a good job of challenging growth as being a dirty word. That actually ultimately you need growth, and especially given what we need to do. If we've got an aging population and we need to decarbonise our economy, we absolutely need the economy to be more productive and more efficient in order to deliver against those things. So I think point number one. But look, especially as someone coming from a business background, one of the things I feel almost you have to do is point out, business people don't go around about thinking about how can I extract as much profit as possible from people. Most business people actually just trying to get to the end of the day, the week, the financial year, and there's a lot of anxiety and stress attached to that. And then I think secondly, if they do, most business people, and there are some unscrupulous business people, but most business people, they know they need to look after their people. They know that the people that work in their businesses, their employees, and the people are absolutely vital to the success of that business. And so you look after them. I grew up in a family business, and it felt like a family a lot of the time. It was a sort of a very fuzzy line, and I just don't think there's necessarily that recognition. And then the final thing is this: I think we also need to recognise and celebrate business success in Scotland. I think we're very quick to shoot that down or assume that that's the result of exploitation, and that's ultimately, in order to succeed, in order to deliver against all these, we need successful businesses, and dare I say it, we need businesses that will be profitable in those endeavours. Because fundamentally, without profit you don't have investment, and without investment you don't have growth, and if you don't have a growing economy, then you don't generate the tax revenues that you need to do to fund public services, and that is quite a difficult thing to do. I'm almost slightly slight bit of trepidation saying that point about profit, but that is
where we are, doesn't it?
But that is the conversation I think that we have to have.
Yeah, and you should be able to say those things without feeling some trepidation or whatever. Okay, and one of the other things you mentioned, and it's a conversation I seem to have when I speak to business people, is about the current setup of the enterprise network in Scotland, or the business promotion network. You seem to be hinting there that you might be willing to grasp the thistle on rethinking perhaps aspects of that, or what can you tell us a bit more about that?
So if you look at the recently published innovation strategy by the government, they identified 8 different agencies in Scotland with some locus on innovation policy, and a total of 21 with some input to it. We're only a nation of 5.5. That is literally bizarre, and I think you see an awful lot of that. It's not just in that area, a number of other areas where you see absolutely ridiculous organisational diagrams which make no sense. If you look at the countries that have very successfully navigated economically challenging times, have successfully secured investment, they've done it through clarity, having one place you go if you want to make investment or seek help, and I think we just need that rationalisation. Do I have a fully worked out organisation plan? I don't yet, but we need a simplification. And look, and I'd put it another way around. I think when you're looking at enterprise support, and coming from a business background, when I was looking at updating the systems in my business, I didn't look at how I was going to finance that, my decision-making process around how to select that, or the training I needed to provide my people in order to operate those systems. as three separate, distinct decisions and therefore that I would need to approach three separate agencies. It was one decision, because you have to think about those things in an integrated way. I don't think we provide enterprise support in that joined up, integrated way. I think this is where I think potentially we need to think about how things are delivered at that regional level at that point, and then potentially having national specialisation. But look, it's complicated, but we certainly need to simplify it for both people seeking to invest in this country, but also I think for businesses seeking to do different things. We just need to make it straightforward and simple and understandable.
We should watch this space on that, I think. If I was a journalist, I am a journalist, my ears are twitching at that.
I'm just glad I can't see the press team or the policy team at the back.
Paul Hutchins here, so he's not on the phone. Pauline, you are Shadow Justice Secretary, and we talk a lot about the economy and think tank land, we like all that kind of stuff, but actually your job is probably the one that the voters are most fascinated by, because they're the ones that live in communities where they have issues with crime and they have issues with drugs and they have issues with violence and gangs and the rest of it. I suppose for me the kind of Labour beginning to take that stuff seriously was kind of 97 with the tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime slogan, which was Brown's, and then Blair nicked it, as he often did. Interested in your, I suppose, the principles that you start with as someone who could foreseeably be running the Justice Department in a few years. Where are you coming from in that, from the origins?
Well, I think you're right to say that what communities expect from a police force, from our justice system, that they will be kept safe, that they can rely on the police to turn up. There's no point in pretending that the justice system needs a great deal of reform. And if you listen to what's been said even through the budget process right now, I've never thought it was about numbers. Okay, so let's get that out there. When I took over the justice portfolio, I said I don't want Labour to talk about numbers. Okay, you've seen a few press releases in the past. I'm sure we'll say, well, the numbers have dropped, fair enough. But what I'm interested in is a quality service that people trust. And the police is the one service that is 24/7. And in fact, Anastasia and I met with the Federation last week, and what we were talking about was that the police were saying it's got to the stage where we cannot be the only public service trying to deal with the social problems in communities, not just crime, because police officers, if you talk to them, deal more with social problems. It could be mental health issues, it could be a one-on-one call, than they do actually with tackling crime. And if we don't reform the system to join the agencies together in thinking about how we're going to deal with these problems, I don't think we will not get the kind of society that we want to live in. So I'm not saying that we've got the answer, I'm telling you what the problem is. So I mean, just to conclude on that, so if there's a police call and someone's at danger of hurting themselves, and then they go to accident emergency, it's the responsibility of the police to get them home safely, because there's no one else to do that. It's not sustainable any longer. It's not a service that's sustainable without having, how do we get agencies to work together? I'll say about, so there's a lot needs done in the justice system, that's for sure. I want to say one thing, it's difficult for any government. So we have the highest remand population in Europe. It's a scandal, actually. And I need to be honest with you and say, I'm not going to sit here and say, I know Jackie Bailey's in the audience as well, so if you remember our first terms in government, we didn't do everything right in relation to prisons, so we didn't do everything right in relation to changing the balance between prisons and community sentencing. But it's quite clear now that we're heading for a complete disaster here. We're locking up people in remand to 27% of the figures today of people who are in jail waiting on trial. So it's not an easy thing to say how to reform that, but there needs to be some thinking done. I conclude on this. I suppose where I would like Labour to be is to think about how you could actually, for once and for all, front load a system that would give the judiciary and agencies some confidence that community sentencing would actually be something that they would feel, for not all crime, but for certain crimes, that they could trust the system to be able to keep communities safe, but not jail so many people. Now, I know that's not an easy thing to do, but it's kind of where I'd like us to be.
And you said you don't want to focus on numbers, but Anas, I think, said recently, FMQs, that Police Scotland said it'll need to lose another 600 police officers and 200 staff next year, and 2,000 staff over the next 4 years. That's on top of the 600 officers it has already lost. The frontline officers are being overworked, are missing out on rest days, and are struggling with their mental health. That sounds a bit, and you mentioned Jackie, it sounds a bit to me like what I hear about the NHS. It sounds a bit to me like what I hear about the education system, where we're asking professionals who are trained to do a specific job to become almost social workers for society across the piece. They're having to step in and plug the holes in society where people are struggling with their mental health, or they're going beyond the remit of what they are comfortable with doing. Or how do we fix that? Because it seems we expect more from government than we have really the funding to deliver. I know this is almost an unanswerable question and not fair to ask it, but maybe
Well, let's just leave it there then. a minute.
maybe from the police side of things, can we get back to, is it a kind of golden age view of the Bobby and out there solving crimes and turning up for things and delivering that and giving the young rascal a pat on the head and a kick up the bum and an apple? Or is there a kind of modern version of this where you talked about tying together services where the right jobs are done by the right people working together rather than...
Oh God. So, I mean, the reason that we're losing the police numbers is a variety of reasons. It's really complex. It's to do with the age of police officers. We've had this in every service as well, people going because the pandemic's made them think differently. All of that anyway. But my view of it is, what I said that police officers do, that has always been the case. Maybe people didn't see it. If you talk to anyone who's served in the police force in the last 20 years, they'll tell you that their job has always been like that. It's maybe you just didn't notice it. But now it's more acute, I guess, because the 101 service, and this is where Scottish policing is unique in that sense. I mean, the Scottish Police Service has I've had some problems, let's say they have, but haven't had the acute problems they have had in English forces. We police differently, and the 101 services, and that's what they were saying, is it's not sustainable in current funding. If you believe in the 101 service, well, it has to be funded. But I go back to the same thing. You cannot have one service, and I will say I don't know what the answer to this is, but I don't think you can have one service that is 24/7. They give up their rest days and they get annual leave cancelled at the last minute, and they expect to recruit people, young people that you want, and from BME communities, to a service where it is could be such a bleak outlook to think that is your life when you're age 25, 26. So that's going to have to change, I think, if we want to get new people coming behind. But maybe we need to talk to other services as well about how we can make sure it's not just the police force that are sustaining 24/7 problems of society and dealing with crime.
Thank you very much. So Paul, your brief is social justice, social security and equalities. So you've had a reasonably relaxed last X months, have you?
Yeah.
Shall I use the word gender, or shall I just stay away from that? One of the things I wanted to talk to you about really was, I guess, the approach we've been taking to poverty in Scotland, and it's a tricky subject to broach because it's been a horrific cost of living crisis, and the people at the very bottom have inevitably borne the brunt hardest. And the Scottish Government's response to that has been, if I can be shorthand about it, to raise taxes and then spend that money on benefits. So they have brought in the Scottish Child Payment, which I think probably few of us would have a problem with. They've topped up various benefits from Westminster. I suppose my criticism, a couple of criticisms of that would be, one, that they've continued putting taxes up, and the middle bit of Scotland, where people are working hard, have mortgages, have children, have spending commitments, have also seen their heating bills rise and their food bills rise and their mortgages rise, and they are squeaking, and the further taxes go up, you reach the point where, I've heard this from Labour people as well, from the communities they're speaking to, it's sort of, we really care about the poor, but we are struggling here ourselves. Can you stop taking all our money, but more money off us? And the other point I'd make is that it does feel a bit like we are doing the fish rather than fishing rod thing, perhaps with some of our underprivileged communities, where we are giving people money, understandable, during a cost of living crisis. We aren't really necessarily giving them the tools to work their way out of poverty, which is a slower and more difficult process, but just as important. And education is the obvious, if there's anything like a silver bullet to that stuff, then education, being able to educate yourself, and social mobility and that sort of thing. But there are other things, other investments that could be made in giving people life chances. Have you been thinking about that much?
Well, it's funny, when Anas appointed me to this brief last year, I did say, oh, that's just a small brief, nothing too much doing in that part of the world. But I'm going to do what third speakers do and lean on what Daniel and Pauline have said, because I think there are clearly huge challenges, and a lot of the challenges that we have to face in terms of that poverty and that ingrained poverty, I think are about our institutions and how well equipped our institutions are to deal with a lot of these structural issues. People will have heard Anna Sawar say that there is no institution in Scotland that is stronger after these 15 years of an SNP government. Actually, I think a lot of our institutions have become weakened and have become really, really challenged with the services they can deliver. So a lot of what Pauline was talking about there, I think, in terms of the challenges that exist around communities facing antisocial behaviour and around the kind of structural causes of that are linked obviously to the trauma that people experience in their lives. And I think public services are really struggling to be able to respond to those very basic needs that people have, which are obviously providing huge challenges. So I'm trying to look at all this through the lens of I suppose what has worked in other places, and whether that's on a global sense or whether they're within the United Kingdom as well. And I'm particularly interested in the work that's been done by Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who was commissioned by Gordon Brown back in 2008 to do the Marmot Review, which was about social determinants of health, so looking at public health and looking at the kind of 5 evils that exist in kind of homage to the Beveridge report, and thinking about how do you essentially use the structures that you have to bolster institutions, essentially, to make them more resilient to deal with the kind of root causes of poverty. So we're doing a lot of work in that space and thinking about, and it maybe comes back to that point that I know Reform Scotland have been looking at about what can we do on a more regional basis and what can we do on a more local basis to really get to the heart of these issues. But I think it goes back to what Daniel spoke about around how do we grow our economy and make sure that the economy is working for everyone, and actually distribution of the kind of the benefits of that economy filter down into communities across the length and the breadth of Scotland, because we know that the experience and the challenges in the Central Belt are not the same as the experiences and challenges that are felt in rural Scotland, but we do need to ensure that money is going and flowing to every part of Scotland. And I think within my brief obviously sits the social security system. We are still in the early days of social security Scotland. Where I think there is potential and opportunity is to really look at how that structure is working. And there are huge challenges, I think, in terms of the way that the Scottish Government have set the system up, the inefficiencies that exist in the system. We've got an IT overspend of about 39 million and increasing. What does the government have to show for that? How do we ensure that the digital technologies that Daniel referred to in his remarks are being harnessed into our public services to make them more accessible and easier to access? And how do we make things as accessible as possible for people, so that when they are living in really difficult, traumatic circumstances or in that cycle of poverty, they know that institutions are there to support them and to do that in a really flexible way and to meet them where they are. So there is a huge job of work, I think, to be done in reform, but I think a lot of that can be done as a spend to save, and actually you can then reinvest those profits. But for me, it's definitely about looking at what are those root causes and how are we using work like, as I say, Michael Marmot, who is, a world leader on this, And actually, we could put Harry Burns in that bracket in terms of work he's done in public health. Listening to those experts and then trying to make that reform as quickly as we can.
Okay. Questions? Now I'll just say my eyesight isn't great and I've forgotten my glasses, so if I know you and I don't recognise you, I'm not being rude, I just can't see you properly. So
It's a good excuse.
that is a good excuse because I'm not very good with names either. So I'll just go around hands. So you, sir, and is it a blue gilet?
Yes,
I'm
thank
going
you,
to take
yeah.
a couple.
Yeah.
And yes, you. So we'll take you two first if you want.
Right. My name's Owen White. I work for DC Thompson. At the centre of our business is a commitment to serve and the communities that we operate in, particularly Aberdeenshire. We've created a new product called eForward, and in a week, over 100 CEOs and CFOs from the energy sector have signed up to join the community we created to accelerate cross-industry collaboration. Daniel, Scotland, I think, can be a world leader in CCUS, wind, green hydrogen. You didn't mention decommissioning. I'll give you an example that plays back to what you said. One of the members has said to me, despite Brexit, he's gone from 0 to 60 staff and 0 to 300 million turnover. For him to get to $1 billion and to start to export all of this Scottish skills and entrepreneurialism, talent, etc. around the world, he needs political stability, and he needs clarity on single market customs union. Now, we've sat here, you've not mentioned either. Single market customs union, Brexit, Europe. How are you going to deliver that stability for him and for the other 100 members that we've secured in 1 week?
Okay.
A social policy question, so kind of slightly other side of that. It's really about the spend to save and the prevention. So I was watching today a brief exchange at Justice Committee between a chief executive of a public body and a leading SNP politician about reforming justice services. It was really about early prevention, early intervention, etc. And the SNP politicians seemed to be asking the public bodies why they hadn't managed to do reform as ministers had made it clear that they wanted it. And I think at the root of that was a failure to understand that budget decisions to support a spend to save model require quite extraordinary levels of political bravery and very difficult decisions that mean that some people lose out in that budget process. So I suppose my question is, and I'm from the Promise Scotland actually, so that keep Promise agenda. How ready are you to defund or reallocate funding from things that they've generally quite like to areas like community justice, social work, for example, that they can't see, they can't touch, and they probably think we're going to be getting away with it.
The tough business of government.
Yeah.
Yes to you, no to you, which
Yeah.
maybe we haven't said enough of recently. Paul, do you want to grab that one first?
Well, I'm married to a social worker, so I go home to these sorts of conversations all the time. Do you know, I do think that we're going to have to, you know, have those conversations about, so if we are interested in the spend to save model, we need to think about how we allocate that resource. And very often, you can't see that spend for quite some time. So, you know, I think in terms of a lot of the good work that's been done in the past has been about using specific change fund models, for example, to be able to say, we want to do a dedicated piece of work that's about preventative spend. But, you know, that will involve having to make decisions. And I think it goes back to, you know, the Christie review and the Christie agenda, and I feel like actually at that point, you know, I was working in the voluntary sector at that point, and I think there was a great desire of hope for change around that whole agenda. I think the current government were rightly praised at that time around that. I think what it has delivered is probably now feeling quite thin. So I do think we need to obviously have a conversation, an ongoing conversation about priorities and thinking about that. But it does come back to my point and Daniel's point about how do we ensure that growing our economy is an economy that's going to work for everyone. And when we say that, we need to genuinely mean that's about those people that aren't always seen and those issues that don't always, you know, aren't always front and centre. And I think the whole agenda around the promise as well, and ensuring that you know, we keep the promise and do that in a really genuine and meaningful way. Because I think very often, and I don't know how you would feel about that, but often it can feel like we are doing tick boxes, and actually that's not always what we need. And there's a lot of good work going on in the background that's not always seen. And I do think we need to talk about that more seriously.
And it must be the case, Pauline, that failure on that front then has an impact on the justice sector, because they have to wash or mop up, if you like, of people that might have been helped to better, more rewarding lives, but who end up a life of crime or in the courts, or with mental health problems or whatever. Is that something you hear from the police as well, that they almost feel that they're having to catch everything that is not being caught by underfunded, underperformed?
I think that's true. I think lots of agencies would say that they just feel that they're at the very end when nothing else has worked. They're just there to pick it up. I know what you're talking about. Right. I did think the same as you. I thought, okay. The problem is that we had the Scottish Prison Service in front of the committee this morning, and as much as I had a bit of an exchange as well, but I do appreciate that it's a statutory function they perform. They have no choice. If we're sending too many people to jail, they have to. I have a huge amount of respect for prison mentors and prison officers, because through the pandemic they had one of the hardest jobs, where people were locked in their cells for 23 hours. So that's why I think that capital projects of building Berlin, which we can now not pin them down for a date, which something that a Labour government in 26 probably inherit if we were lucky enough. Lucky enough to be elected. So it seems to me without some capital expenditure, we can't free up the prison estate to do things. But the question that you asked about earlier, I mean, it is the fundamental question for every government department, and it is very hard to crack, because at some point you'd have to say, well, who's going to be the loser here, unless you can find money to front load it. I think I could conclude by saying, well, I can only talk to my brief, so I'm not in charge of what a manifesto would look like or anything. But if I could just say this to my colleagues, well, I hope Jackie Bailey would agree with me, but anyway, I wasn't a minister, but I was chairing the committee for 6 years, and I felt that because we were the first government, we had every piece of legislation imaginable, because it had been waiting in Westminster. And I can tell you, we were tied in knots with good legislation, reform of summary justice. We did the reforms of the High Court. I feel like we're back to square one now, because the delays in the courts are so bad, and we passed more legislation today to allow the courts to delay court trials even further. Maybe I was thinking this when you were talking, Daniel. I would quite like to see, if Labour got to government in 26, that we learn the lessons from that. There's a lot. I think it's the big mistake of the SNP government, actually. Well, one of many, but this is one. Is some of the stuff they're doing. I really feel if they cleared the decks on law reform, they could do more by collaboration and change stuff around fireworks and some of the attitude changes. I do accept you need to change the law. More could be done. I think if government wasn't so busy trying to get difficult laws through. And even if you support the court reforms, judge-only trials and the not proven verdict, all worthy things, if you don't carry the profession with you, you suck all your time up trying to persuade them, where maybe that some of that time could have been spent talking about how to get early prevention strategies.
Okay, that's really interesting. Daniel, the other question.
So, can I deal with the first one? So, look, I mean, there's a sense in which I used to do finance and economy, so I always have to sort of bite my tongue a little bit. And what I'm not going to do is start preempting what approaches Michael might want to take in terms of financial management. But let's be very clear. We have a very opaque budgetary process in Scotland. We have a process whereby the budget is set at one level, and even at that point, all the arguments is at level 3 and level 4 of the budget. The budget bill is only set at level 1. The outturn reports against only level 1 rather than level 3 and level 4. The finalised accounts are actually not done on the same category. So even in the budgetary, one of the fundamentals of budget, when you're setting a new budget, you look at how you perform against last year's budget. We can't even do that in Scotland. Certainly not in the public domain. So I think in terms of what we can do. I mean, I absolutely accept it's difficult, and you need to decide what you're going to stop doing, some of those things. But you actually need to get to square one of actually being clear about what you're currently doing with your current budget settlement. And right now, we have a real lack of transparency. So I think it's about delivery focus, having transparency, but critically, if you have a growing economy, then you create that space, and you need to also, I think, then ensure that you have funds in order to do new things, different things, and with clear objectives, so that you can then use them to do different things when those projects and those outcomes come to an end. And I just think we're very bad at that in terms of financial planning in Scotland. On the point, look, I think the most destabilising thing we could do, it would be to reopen the whole debate regarding our position in Europe. And frankly, I would get lynched by my UK colleagues if I did on a stage here in Edinburgh. But I think the difference you will have, and you've already seen it from the first time out, is that we absolutely have to recognise the challenges that have been created. We have to recognise, it's not just for people seeking to do oil well decommissioning. And I have spoken to some oil well decommissioning firms, and it's really fascinating. Absolutely, given the age and stage that our offshore sector is, we have a real opportunity to create kind of essentially integrated providers, as opposed to essentially the people that own the oils having to piece it together themselves. And that it may well be the same firm that we've been speaking to, but I recognise that. But look, what you will get from Labour is a pragmatic approach. What you saw over the summer was Keir Starmer making it a very clear point and setting clear direction in terms of his dialogue with Europe, recognising the problems, and whether it's people seeking to decommission oil wells, or closer to my the number of small small exporters exporting to the EU has absolutely vanished. You've gone from small businesses making small products, potentially having kind of up to 80% of their products being export products going to the EU, to that collapsing to almost nothing. So I think we've got to be pragmatic. I think what you'll see from the Labour government is looking at how we can fix those things, come up with solutions on a bilateral basis. I think that's what Keir Starmer was saying this summer, and I think that's actually how we create stability, rather than kind of reopening that whole question again. But it's absolutely vital. We need to understand that this is a global economy, and that frankly every economy needs to accept that you have to trade with the world on the world's terms. You don't get to dictate to the world. I mean, that would be my fundamental point of view.
If I was just to come back on that very briefly, and feel free to cut me off, that example you've just given, you gave the example of you don't make profit, you make loss, you don't make loss, you don't invest. That example you've just given, put that on steroids, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of other marginal losses across businesses around the UK that are a result of that. So whilst I respect your answer on I don't want to reopen it, the fact of the matter is, if you want to create jobs, investment, momentum and growth, you've got to tackle that loss that has been inflicted on business by the decision to leave the European Union. If you kick the can down the road, you're going to move nowhere.
So the glib way of putting it is we can't reopen it, but we do need to fix it. And I mean, I think that is it's a clear and top priority, but we'll need to be pragmatic.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions. James, you've got a question. I can't see. I'm aware of the question time posted. So you said the lady in the purple dress, and he said it, the Bishop of Bath. So it's quite dark back there. So I can see the lady in the orange top. Is that right? And then the gentleman to there with your hand up as well. We'll take 3 this time. So Hamish, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it will seem like a minor subject, but I think it's got implications. I just like to lay before you the issues I see that the Labour Party are talking about putting VAT on fees in private independent schools. Now, that I would describe as the stick, and at the end I will hopefully come back with the carrot. Some background. The sector, everybody believes the sector is financed by a lot of wealthy people who can send us kids to school. That is not the case. The sector is by far from being homogeneous. It is unbelievably wide in terms of the structure and the parents, etc., what they're earning. The likes of Fetties or Eton or whatever, doesn't matter what you charge, they will not close down. But there are hundreds or dozens of schools, smaller schools, which if this happens, they will just have to close. Because you're talking now about 20% going on fees, and that is before the inflation is added on top of that. So you could be talking about between 25 and 30% on fees, and that is just not not workable, because a lot of schools at the moment are actually on the waterline of surpluses. These are not businesses; these are charities, and they don't spend the money and they don't pay dividends. They accumulate surpluses in order to invest in the schools in the future. So, you know, the facts are that there is a risk, and I've seen numbers running between 2,000 and 6,000 pupils could be out of a school sometime in the next 2 years if this happens. Well, sorry, if you're back in power, maybe further down the line, but that's the sort of scale you're talking about. And there are 30,000 kids at private schools at the moment, and in Scotland, and that is, if that were that sort of number, 6,000, which is sufficient, that would be a hell of a hit in terms of what the state can do. Therefore, how much thought has been put into this just very statement about adding VAT onto fees? It's a big issue, because what the state, I don't think, can cope straight away. How quickly can they build schools, etc.? Where would they go? What buildings have they got? You can't put them back in the same school, because these buildings are privately owned, sort of idea. So the knock-on effect is huge, and it's particularly huge in Edinburgh with such a proportion of private schools. So the question I really have to ask you all is, how much thought has really been given around the ramifications of this additional 20% of the fees? Secondly, what contingency have you in place with several thousand, let's say 2,000 to 6,000 people suddenly arriving on your doorstep looking for places in an already packed state system? And how quickly can the public services actually build new schools? I suspect it's 2 or 3 or 4 years in some cases. So that seems to be the stick, as I said before. Surely a carrot-based approach is better, which tasks independent schools to form meaningful relationships or partnerships with the state schools, would surely be a far less risky solution all round. And there's a lot of things that are going on in the private schools at the moment in terms of innovative thinking, innovative developments. My old school in the last 18 months has set up distance learning, and so far 61,000 people have actually used this system. This is because schools in the state sector don't have teachers in all the areas, so they can now get onto the Dollar Academy system and get the training that way. And that's 44 schools, state schools that they've used so far. A long way to go. There are 384 state schools in total, but that just shows you the magnitude of which that is taking place. So I'm afraid, I think this has got to be thought through very carefully, otherwise there's a real danger that you could have a catastrophe in the education, or bigger catastrophe in the education system than we've already got.
Thank you. Hamish, yeah.
Hi, I'm Banshee Kelly. I'm a board member on a small charity, the Observatory for Sports in Scotland, and our purpose is to help promote the value of particularly community sport. And I think probably the question I want the panel to talk about for us is, we're mystified that when there's lots of activity and lots of brilliant sporting activity going on in Scotland, some of it convened by government help, a lot of just by communities themselves, but there is no strategic, coherent view of the value of sport in Scotland. And that may seem a little bit controversial, but from our position, that's what we've been seeing all the time. And I wondered what you think in terms of the kind of how you would harness the power of sport as a strategic view for Brand Scotland, for the economy, for the health and well-being of workers, for the ageing population, and for the inspiration for kids. So is there any thinking done on how you might get a strategic view of the value of sport for Scotland? Is really the big question I'd like to ask.
Thanks very much. And then the gentleman. Yep.
Governmentally, Scotland is one of the most over-centralised countries in the developed world. 50 years ago, we had a reform of local government which resulted from the extended thinking of a Royal Commission plus several years of subsequent discussion. And that lasted 20 years. We then had a further reform which was carried through by a junior Tory minister who had probably thought about it all evening, and we are still operating under that system, but I hear no political party talking about change in that area. So my question is the Labour Party interested in reviving local democracy, not necessarily in its traditional form, and if so, what does it want to do about it?
Excellent question, Kieran. Okay, well, let's start with the first question, Hemsh's question about independent schools. It's not just a Labour Party issue. I think the SNP also have a policy on this where I suppose they're looking to, you might say, squeeze independent private schools rather than make them work for the community, which I think is what you were touching on, Hamish, about using their facilities more broadly for state schools and having sort of closer relationships which actually state school pupils could benefit from some of the things that independent schools have the resources to do. Who would like to pick that up? You're in Edinburgh, MSP.
I think look. First of all, this is a UK Labour policy, and look, it stems from something that's really fundamentally important.
You're also privately educated, aren't you?
I am
just
indeed.
remembered. Yeah.
But don't hold that against me. You know, you threw me off there.
Sorry, but I was trying to look right.
So we have an absolute kind of focus on ensuring that we have fiscal discipline. We will not make pledges that we cannot state either where we are going to make savings or additional levies. So, and there is an absolutely overarching need to generate more revenue to invest in our schools, and in particularly in England. When you look at the spend per pupil, it has been absolutely hammered. So it is a very difficult decision, and I think Keir Starmer and our UK colleagues have been very clear. There is a recognition for the contribution that independent schools make, but we also need to make a choice. And if we want to invest in education more, we will need to think about how we raise taxes. And I think there is a question about the fairness, given that we have VAT as a consumption tax. It is a decision that people will make, and therefore, why shouldn't that levy apply to that discretionary spend? But it is a difficult one, and I think you raised two important points.
Well.
And they are charities. And first of all, in my own constituency, there's been I think very important work done. So, for example, there's a fantastic Chinese program led by George Watson's, which now I think takes in 15 or so schools across the wider area, and has been a fantastic collaboration. And frankly, you will hear the principal teachers of the original secondary schools that were collaborating, speak in very, very high terms. I think we need that needs to be recognised. And then, I am a high school short in my constituency. If I look at the overcapacity, but these are the tough choices that we need to make. It will be something that I have had to talk about and explain to my constituents. And I think the overarching need is to identify how we can raise revenue to invest in schools. But it is a difficult choice, and there will be difficult details that we need to navigate.
Reform Scotland is very focused on education as well as other things, and I think we'll probably do a specific event on this, because I'm fascinated by the choice between exactly that, between whether independent schools are doing enough to deserve the charitable status if they could do more, or whether you have to basically, make it more difficult for them to
And
operate
that's
by
really
taking more
critical.
money off them. And can you do both, or do you have to choose one or the other?
And this is a good way of putting it. It's not. I don't think it's good enough for independent schools to simply let people book their five-a-side football pitches and floodlights, and that I don't. In my
That's
opinion,
not happening.
makes
That's
sense.
moved on from that. Enormous.
That was happening. In fact, without
We shall
pointing
have
any fingers, but
a specific conversation.
exactly.
outside.
But
don't-
and I think I'm also pointing to things. Can I just briefly comment on Keir Bloomer's
Please do,
question?
yeah,
Look, I mean, I think I was alluding to in my comments. I think we need to take a very, very close look at what's happening. I think particularly combined authorities, but other structures. I don't think there's massive appetite for us to create a whole new tier of government. I think, but I think looking at what is being delivered through combined authorities in the Metro regions in England, I think is something that we need to pay very close attention to, and think about how potentially we can learn those lessons. I don't want to be, I wouldn't want to go further, but I think that's something. I've got a trip planned early in the new year to go down, and it's going to be very much a working session in Manchester, looking at actually the structures, what that has enabled them to do, and what they would say the lessons are. But I mean, again, my glib way of summing all of that up is we sort of treat. I can't remember if it was Ian Lang or Michael Forsyth that came up with the current unitary authorities, but we've basically for the last 30 years been treating it as though they came up with kind of the perfect form of local government, and we must not touch it ever since. And I sort of slightly glibly point that out to SNP ministers when they come before committees, but it's been the way it is for quite a long time. I think it's quite clear that there are some real deficiencies to the current structures, and not least of which around the economy, because frankly there is no incentive for local authorities to grow their local economies. They collect non-domestic rates, but that gets filtered into the centre and redistributed, and yet they're the ones that control the way the space gets used, through the planning system. And so I think there are some clear things that I think that we should look at and correct and learn from. But I think it's absolutely something we're looking at.
So there will be more decentralisation and localism under a Labour government. We just haven't figured out what.
We're 2.5 years away.
Yeah, I'm not criticizing. I'm just establishing the principle is there.
Paul, it's like he was
I'm not going
sleeping.
to give you the answer. No. Having been a councillor for 10 years, so I suppose approaching this from, and a number of colleagues in the Parliament have been in local government. I think it's clear that we do have to have some of that conversation. And Ass himself, leaned into some of Reform Scotland's work about do we need more elected, whatever it is, in terms of who might run a combined authority or whatever. I think for me, we have structures in Scotland that exist almost kind of organically, like, out of City Deal came City Regions in quite an organic way. Do they work well? That's for a discussion, but I think actually they haven't ever been really tested. I mean, obviously they had parts of education reform put into them. Keir probably could have a whole kind of session on that, and obviously this week we've heard that those kind of regional collaboratives are maybe not as in vogue, and we're going to look at something different. So there's almost been an organic sort of setting up of these city regions. I think we need to get into the detail of how have they worked and what more can we do in them. But to go back to the point about localism and not perhaps doing big is beautiful, maybe comes back to the point I was making about the work of Michael Marmot, which actually talks about where is it appropriate to take decisions that will have an impact on the social determinants of health and the delivery of services. Something like air pollution, absolutely, should be dealt with on a more regional basis, I think, and that city region approach. And the nighttime economy and the wider economies of the Glasgow city region is something Pauline and I have spoken about a lot, and about the impact on the whole of the West Coast, essentially. But obviously there are other decisions we would want to see taken at a more local level, perhaps about the delivery of some of the services that we're maybe talking about in the context of the answer to the question about the promise, and about those social services that are available. So I think all of that needs to be really thought through.
Yeah. Pauline, have you got any strong opinions on sport? Or do you want to phone a friend? Is Jackie still in the audience?
Well, I think it's a good question. The value of sport. I always thought that people did value sport at different levels, but what struck me was that, but there's different levels to it. I mean, for young girls, I don't think much has changed. They get to a certain stage in their life and it's harder to get them to take up sport. So finding different ways to get them involved is a really powerful thing for them. But forgive me, I do believe in the power of sport, but I also think that there are other similar powerful concepts in society. Music, for example, I say that because it's close to my heart, but to me it's the same idea that these are ways to engage with people who don't engage, to revive communities that don't get revived. And in music, I am not an expert in sport, as you can see, so you can tell me what you think, but I do know about music, and I know that the loss of music tuition in schools, which is a really valuable thing for learning, for confidence, for dexterity, it is a loss of a generations to come. So I'm all for it having programs in government that recognise the value of sport and music and other things that are out with the normal sort of traditional I suppose sectors, if you like. Can I just say, Keir's question about reviving local democracy, I'd like to know what Keir was looking for out of that question, but more controversially, honestly, I get a little bit frustrated by this debate. I do want to decentralise government. So Paul's talked about the city region, but there isn't a lot of transparency. I'm trying to get to the bottom of let's take the metro, the Clyde metro, right? What's the governance? Who are the decision makers? You cannot, you made this point earlier, there's too much of this. You can't see who the decision makers are, and that needs to change. And for me, it's not just about taking power down to local authorities. I don't know if that's what you're meaning. It's got to be more than that.
Yeah.
Because if I'm honest, I see some decision making in local authorities I don't think are transparent either, and communities don't feel involved in. They feel exactly the same way about that as they maybe do about Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament. So for me, reviving local democracy has got to be a bit more than that, but I wasn't sure what answer you were looking for.
Well, I was talking about local democracy. I wasn't necessarily talking about local government. I don't think this is about redrawing the lines on the map. I think it's about getting people actively involved in decision making, and I don't think that is done by the kind of agglomerations that were being spoken about earlier on, which are not transparent at all, as you were just saying, Pauline, in my view, perfectly correctly. So the answer that I'm looking for is one that is about reviving people's active participation in decisions that affect their lives. And by the way, Daniel, it was Alan Stewart.
Famous Alan Stewart, who could forget Alan Stewart, yeah. Right, but we're nearly done. Any last couple of questions? Chap right at the back, and then the chap, you. So start at the back. Two more and then we're done.
I've come down from Stonehaven, Aberdeenshire today, and slightly different up in the northeast. But what I'd like to say is that the first thing I want to see in this general election is that between Labour, Conservative and Lib Dems, you wipe out the SNP at this next general election, and you've got a good chance to do the same thing in Scotland, because we really need that badly. It's not just because of the Constitution, it's the way things are being run. And I've heard a lot of good things from you tonight. And Polly, Neil mentioned the police. He spoke to my son and my daughter-in-law, both in the police, and I agreed totally with what you just said about the police federation. But there's a few things I wouldn't mind asking about.
Could you keep it to one, because we're pretty much
It's
prioritise.
something about how you win votes in. The first one is, somebody mentioned the IT and the technology industry. I worked in it for 43 years in Scotland and abroad for Oracle, NCR, and Borough, people remember them. And the IT industry in Scotland is a joke these days. The basic small company. And I think the sooner people realise that, the better. The second thing, you talk about your energy transition. Just about 2 years ago, you announced Energy Commission, and about a year and a half ago, you announced that Brian Wilson was going to be chairing it. And I wrote a couple of letters in the paper saying that's a real masterstroke. Somebody knows what he's talking about. I looked on the website for it the other night there. there's one page in it, the page that you started off with, the announcement page. There's nothing else on it. But to be a bit more positive in terms of how you might win votes, this whole issue of the cost of housing, and for young families the cost of childcare, that are both people having to work to get by so they can pay their mortgage, and that's not just the sort of middle class ones, it's just about everybody. Have you ever thought about building more council houses to a plan like it used to be, like where I used to live when I was a kid? And secondly, you've got your own policy in the UK for childcare, where you're reducing the age at which people get their childcare paid for. And I've never heard the Labour Party in Scotland really talking much about that on anything. But that's something that you can be talking about now in this election. And I don't know how many voters are of that age, but there's got to be a lot of them who, if they saw that you were going to be providing, and I know it's from one, I've got 4 grandchildren under 3 at the moment, and 2 sons and daughters-in-law working full time to try and match this up. And I'm just down here today after spending a day looking after my granddaughter. It's fine for us, but a lot of people don't have that kind of help around. But you've already got this costing, and Scotland will get that money as well, I would understand, although it's only an England and Wales policy. If you're an English and Welsh policy, it would come to Scotland because of the Barnett formula. I don't know why you're not saying more about that. And secondly, have you thought about building council houses? You can get prefab houses, they're low cost. Most of my family lived in prefabs in the 60s and 70s. People can know what they're paying for it. You can maybe give them an opportunity to buy it at the end or some way of ownership. But nobody talks about council houses these days. And it's got to be a lower cost, more secure household than what people are going through, young people are going through just now, especially single families.
Thanks, Alan. You asked all your questions.
Well played. Try to keep them short.
Well played. Right, last question. Yeah.
So you mentioned the economy there, so I'm Andy from Social Enterprise Scotland, and you mentioned there's kind of a not a clear framework for businesses. There's too many agencies. So recently there was the Social Enterprise World Forum in Amsterdam, and you had countries all over the world coming to Amsterdam, but talking to Scottish social enterprises saying you're getting this right, you're doing it right. Social enterprises have just moved in the Scottish Government from the third sector into the economy now. So I think it's something that can play into the economy if you want to try and grow it. Now the social enterprise 10-year strategy started in 2016 and is going to finish in 2026. So if you see where I'm coming from here, is there a plan for maybe social enterprise in 2026?
That's neat, isn't it? You're right. Okay, well, housing and childcare, I guess, were the 2 things that Alan majored on.
I'll talk about housing. I was a spokesperson not so long ago. I feel quite passionate about housing. We did actually publish, it would have been, get this right, in 2021, we quite a radical housing policy, which just talked about housing is central to tackling poverty, and housing has to feature much more centrally as a transformational difference that it can make to people's lives. So yes, in that we are for mass building of homes for social rent, and that would involve new communities as well. But we also comment in the report about the importance of people having the opportunity to own their own home as well, and having that choice. And unfortunately, the generation that we're talking about here, from probably age 25 to 45 now, that's how wide that gap is. Particularly now because of mortgage interest rises and so on, and a pandemic. I don't know where it is now, but at the time of writing the report, is a real concern that for that age group that previously would have had home ownership open to them, no longer, and that obviously puts huge pressures on the housing system. So it's going to be a massive issue to solve for any Labour government, but I can send you that if you're interested. And on childcare, it's not my policy area, maybe it's more Daniel's, because it's both a social issue and an economic issue. I think I'm clear about that, because unless you give parents the means to go to work and have their children safely looked after, it's a shame that you think that we've been silent on it, because actually it was a Labour government that first introduced it, and we're very proud of it at the time, and I'm pleased to see that the current government has continued the policy. It's fundamental, I think, for any fair society to have a child care policy. So, but maybe Daniel, that's more your brief than mine.
Look, I mean, I think one of the real problems we've got with the childcare policy at the moment is it's at a bit of a breaking point in terms of the funding levels. And I think so. If you look at what has happened, is we've had the commitment to 1140 hours, but we've seen a reduction in the number of providers. I mean, the reduction number of childminders has been absolutely catastrophic. So, and as Pauline points out, I mean, there's absolutely critical need to get this right. The interruption to people's working life through parenthood, is something that is quite significant, and especially at a time when we have labour shortages. I think actually making sure that these things don't remove people from the labour market or don't disrupt their. So I think we need, childcare is a really good example of where we need to actually look about how this integrates with wider economic policy.
It's happening next year. It's starting next April in England. The Tories are doing it, and Labour, Keir Starmer has said that you support it.
Yeah.
That's
So we'll just exactly. So we'll need to look at what policies, but absolutely that the centrality of childcare, the economy, is absolutely clear. And I mean, the other thing I would just point out on homes, we have never recovered our level of housing completions following the financial crash in 2008. And actually, I think this is one of the things where the Scottish Government has been very disingenuous, that they will slice it and dice it and look at particular categories. But look, we fundamentally, in the midst of a cost of living crisis, a part of which is a cost of housing crisis, and we are. It's been quite. I was at a meeting yesterday with Shelter, and they were very clear. So there are well-intentioned policies at the moment which are fundamentally making it harder to address that supply issue. And I think we need to be very clear, right? And I think it was very encouraging to hear Keir say in his speech that just how important house building would be, the commitment to 1.5 million homes, and we will absolutely seek to ensure that we translate that and bring that here. I think just briefly on the social enterprise. Look, social enterprise is hugely important, and I think a great example of how you can deliver change in a way that is self-sustaining. That is dynamic, and actually critically, I think it goes to heart of what is something I think is really important across all businesses. I think successful businesses really need to understand people, and the centrality of people to successful enterprise. And I think social enterprise has that sort of human-centered approach to business enterprise at its absolute core. So yes, it's an important thread. I think it's one that will continue, both in terms of economic policy, but actually also how we seek to address social issues. But I also think it has some fundamental insights across broader enterprise as well.
And you can write a strategy for them.
Looking forward to it.
You've got your offer. Well, we're out of time. I'm really sorry if I didn't get to your question. It was either because we had too many or I couldn't see you. It's very much our intention at Reform Scotland to do more of these things. I think the closer we get certainly to 2026, over the next 3 years, we're very keen to hear what Labour has to offer, including the other parties as well, but certainly Labour seem to be on the rise. We want to know what they're thinking as their thoughts develop. I think we've seen they're in a place tonight where they are beginning to develop policy. Some bits are more thought through than others, but they will have to have answers by the time they ask for the vote in 2026. So let's hold their feet to the fire on that, and I'm sure they'd welcome that, and we're very keen to do it at Reform Scotland, very keen to hear from our community who have obviously such intelligent, thought through questions. So we'll do more of this, and if you didn't get a question tonight, you will get a question next time. But thank you very much again to Daniel, Pauline and Paul for giving up your time, and thanks to all of you for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.